Morning, everybody. How's it going?
Morning.
How you folks doing? Guess we're halfway through the quarter. We're more than halfway through the quarter, right? This is week 7. Yeah, good. All right, we're getting there. Oh, Mac is sideways. That's kind of cool.
Oh,
Um,
really?
that's all right. No problem. And so thank you for finishing the exam, everybody. I haven't had a chance to look at it, but I wanted to see if there was any questions. I probably I'm hoping to get everything back to you guys by Friday. Assuming everything goes smoothly this week, work-wise, that shouldn't be a problem. Okay, and I'll just send you back your exams with comments and the number grade on there. Okay. Were there
I have one
questions?
question
Yeah.
about it. What's phenomenalism?
Oh, phenomenalism is that we can only know our own experience. Well, the way we discussed it, yes, it is that we only can know our own experience. We really can't know the outside world directly. So it's like the next step down from up from solipsism, where solipsism is kind of the doubting that there is a real world or the assumption that there is no real world. Phenomenalism doesn't make that strong a claim. It suggests instead that we can only know our experience, and it is. I think it assumes that there's a real world, but it's agnostic, more or less, with regard to that. Okay. Other questions?
I was just thinking I really should have studied the Gestalt
Oh,
stuff a lot more. I spent
okay.
too much time on the other stuff.
Yeah. Well, if you partially answered questions, that helps a lot. It really only becomes a problem. I think sometimes people, if they don't feel like they know the whole answer, they don't answer any of the part of the question. But that doesn't happen too much. So hopefully you folks at least had something down for each, and that's fine. And if everyone struggled for a particular question, I certainly will take that into account. Okay. All right, other questions about the exam? Okay. Again, I'll hopefully have it back on Friday. Fingers crossed that there's no departmental emergencies or anything like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue our discussion. And what we're going to start talking about today is some kind of idiosyncratic criticisms of the computational approach. We'll at least start with that, and then we'll move into the connectionist approach. All right. Let me just check here. There we go. Let me pin myself. All right, there I am. Boy, look at my head. We've got a serious haircut, but I might as well shaved it, huh? Look at that. Huh. Anyway, in some magical way, Zoom makes me appear even more bald than I actually am. That's something to consider if you ever teach Zoom, and you're in your middle age and you lose any hair. Zoom makes you even balder. All right. So we're never really going to leave the computational approach in a sense, because we are going to be talking about connectionism next, and then later on in the quarter, I'll be talking about some more modern instances of this. But in some ways, the computational metaphor, the computer metaphor, will be keeping with us, except for one approach, which I'll be talking about in another week or so, the ecological approach. But the computational approach can be really considered any approach that assumes that there is computations made on representations. And as you'll see, that includes pretty much any theory of psychology, let alone cognitive science. If you're talking about mental representation, which most psychology theories do, and there's a manipulation of those representations, and there's kind of algorithmic processes, just processes in general of those representations, then you are, in one form or another, talking about a computational approach in a lot of ways. So we will be coming back to it. As I said, the next approach we'll be talking about is the connectionist approach. And even though it's going to take a very different form in some ways, it still does involve representations and computations, but the algorithmic sort of aspect of it is going to be, I guess we can say, loosened up in some ways and made more dynamic. But I wanted to, before we left kind of the kind of core discussion of the computational approach, I wanted to bring up some issues that are, I think, really interesting. They're written about in a paper called, I think it's called the Inadequacies of the Computer Metaphor. I think that's the name of the paper, as I remember. And it was written by my old advisor many years ago, and I think it's still relevant. It's still heavily cited, and it brings up some really interesting points. And what they do, the authors of the paper, is they kind of take very seriously what is involved in, I guess, a Turing machine and how it relates to what we know about things in the physical world. Now, we know, the way Turing had originally described his device, it was kind of an infinite machine in some ways. It had infinite memory, it had infinite processing speed, and he was very aware at the time, certainly, that there was nothing that could do that. And even though computers have gotten ridiculously more powerful since then, the authors of this paper are going to claim that there are still aspects of physical devices that a computational approach in concept really can't capture. So they discuss what they call the physics of knowing things, and what they're really describing here is the physics of animals, humans, and what sort of systems are required to support what we would, at least on some level, characterize as systems that have some awareness of the world, some understanding of the world, perceive the world in meaningful ways, and whether a computational metaphor is going to be satisfactory to kind of handle that stuff. So they bring up the Turing machine, and they kind of remind us of what that's going to involve, and that, as I mentioned, is a machine with infinite memory and infinite processing speed. And again, it's something that Turing was well aware of, that at his time there was nothing like that. And if we've gotten so much more powerful, have we gotten to the point where we can really say that whatever characteristics Turing's machine kind of predicted, that a lot of what could be handled by some more powerful machines, if it is in theory something that is true. And what the authors of this paper suggest is that there are some problems with the entire idea that infinite processing speed, infinite memory kind of bring up. And they suggest that it's not a problem of kind of developing machines that can handle these aspects. It is, in principle, something that can't be captured with a computational device. So algorithms, as we've been discussing them, and as certainly Turing discussed them, and most computational theories assume, have in principle have no energy demand, where real animals and real computers do have energy demands, and real animals do have energy demands. So when Turing described a computational approach, as we kind of continue the computational approach, certainly we realize that they are going to be instantiated in computers and animals that do have energy demands and interact with the environment in an energetic sort of way. They lose energy, they gain energy, all that sort of stuff. What they're saying is that energy transfer doesn't really play a role in how we assume the algorithms work. Okay, so that's kind of the important point here. That there's no kind of consideration of the energy transfer that naturally happens in the world, whether we're talking about a computational system in an animal or human, or a computational system in an actual computer. And that energy transfer, they're arguing in this paper, is a critical part of how these systems actually work. Okay, so it's not really an issue. Well, it's just a question of getting the super powerful computers that have, much more processing speed, that have much more memory. It is inherent in an algorithmic based system that really no energy interaction with the world is really taken into consideration. But things in the world certainly do have interactions. So what they say, and this is a little tricky, they say that anything that's working in the natural world is going to work along two different simultaneous kind of levels of processing. One is called what we'll call the discrete mode, and the other the dynamic mode. So let's go ahead and give some examples of this. So living systems, we can come back to actual computers in just a second, but living systems, the systems that we're trying to explain, whether it's people, animals. I saw, my octopus teacher finally, and I'll be happy to talk about that outside of class and what I really thought of it. But an octopus is a great example. Sure, we'll go with the octopus. It interacts with the environment in what many biologists can construe as two modes of operation. One is what can be called the discrete mode with symbol strings and rules, and that whether the symbol strings are discussed as some sort of algorithm in the processing of the octopus, some sort of rule system of what the octopus will do at what time. But importantly, the octopus and the person also interacts with the world in a lawful, dynamic, energy regarding way. Okay, so let's think of our octopus friend. It is absolutely dealing with energy interactions, and all I mean by this is expending energy to move, incorporating energy as it eats, and that and that goes back and forth, and that is a really important way of how the system is guided. And while that is a natural part of knowing things, according to these authors, a computer doesn't really, a computational approach where you're just considering computations made on representations is just really considering this kind of symbol string rule level of processing. And what these theoretical biologists say, and these cognitive scientists, is that that's just a little piece of what animals usually do. They usually interact in both modes with the environment. Okay? And the example that it's discussed in the paper, the example that kind of makes it intuitive to me is, I know it's going to sound really odd, but it's a physical system. It's not actually a biological system, but I think it actually kind of really exemplifies what's meant by the interaction of a discrete mode of processing and a dynamical mode of processing. And it's the idea of a curtain. Now you can't see, but behind me, since I don't want you to see the studio here, there is a curtain. There's actually a green screen. And it's not actually kind of set up very nicely, but imagine this green screen behind me was actually set up to be like a curtain, like you might see in front of a movie screen or a theater before the play started, or at your home, right? I actually, when I lived in Riverside, I moved into a home that had these really fancy curtains. It wasn't my style, but they had these kind of fancy, I don't know what you call them, I guess like theater stage curtains, where they kind of made half circles, and they kind of drooped down in very kind of elegant ways. I ended up taking them down. They really weren't me, but you could tell a lot of work went into them. Somebody clearly came in and spent time fastening the curtains up on the rod above the window in a very, very precise way, so it could make these kind of shapes coming like this, and they overlapped with each other. Ooh. Anyway, it was a shame I took it down, but I did certainly respect the work, because what it involved was placing the curtains at exactly the right position, attaching the curtains in the exact right position. And the curtains had to be bunched up and then fastened in the right position, and they had to be bunched up in just the right way. They had to be folded in exactly the right way. I mean, clearly some time went into this. And for me, that's the kind of most intuitive way for me to think about the relationship between a discrete and a dynamic mode. So what's discrete here? Well, you can think of, how the curtains were actually fastened to the board or the rod as kind of the constraints that then allow the dynamics of the curtains themselves, the kind of the physical laws of gravity and all that stuff, mass, acting on the curtains to provide these beautiful patterns. So the constraints, okay, I quote, rules that involved fastening the curtains to the rod in very specific ways provided kind of the guidance that then was manifest by the dynamical laws of how gravity pulled down the curtains, and the elasticity of the curtains was part of the dynamics, all that sort of stuff. So in something like a complex system that you could call this curtain hanging, it was an interaction of, kind of very kind of, I guess, spare constraints on how things worked. And much of the elegance, much of the beauty of the curtains actually is provided by gravity, and how gravity kind of bears on the material that the curtain was made up of. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about this relationship. Now let's bring it back to biological systems. To make this, let's just stay with intuitive examples. Let's think about ourselves walking in our step cycle. And you know that as you move, you coordinate your opposite limbs. As you walk, you coordinate your opposite limbs. And it is well known for people that do kinesiology and all that sort of stuff, that the body makes full use of gravity. We are talking about pendular sort of objects here swinging in gravity, and we know a pendulum clock will swing back and forth, and a weight on the end of a string will swing back and forth, all that sort of stuff. The body makes use of that, and more importantly, the nervous system makes use of that. So that when you speed up, where the swinging is actually guided is in a very small portion of the actual movement. Okay, so it's like, it's like pushing a kid on a swing, right? In order to get them higher, you don't need to run back and forth holding the swing. You just need to impart a little bit more force at exactly the right time to a very small portion of the trajectory of the movement of the swing. It's the same thing with our limbs. Okay, if you want to speed up your walking, or if you want to start running and speed up your running, where the change occurs to go from slow to fast is a very, very small part of the step cycle. Okay? And that's a really nice example of how, kind of the discrete system of how the nervous system is actually changing the coordination affects what is really the kind of the natural coordination that occurs from, swinging pendula in a natural world that's gravitational and all that stuff. So that's another example, along with the curtains, of how kind of discrete kind of rules can bear on how gravity is used in both of these cases, and it doesn't have to be gravity as well. So these are all the examples of the genetic code, and I'll let you read that. I can't remember the details of that. I don't want to mess it up. I'll let you read that in the paper, where the genetic code and how the unfolding of proteins and all that sort of stuff is constrained by that code. And in all these examples, it's not like there is an algorithm that kind of constrains every single part of what you're experiencing, whether you're seeing curtains, whether you're moving, whether, you know, it's how the genetic code works. What happens is the dynamic mode, you know, the gravity on the curtains, how, you know, the gravity works on the kind of pendular motion of our limbs. It kind of interprets the discrete mode. And you know, for complex systems, not just living systems, for most complex systems that we see in nature, that's the way things typically work. And when you do a computational model of something, when you do you know, if you kind of bring the computer metaphor to these very, you know, kind of natural complex systems, you're kind of losing not only, you know, kind of an understanding of the dynamic mode in a way, but you're understanding the critical interaction between the dynamic and the discrete mode. Okay. Now, what they say is that is a, you know, you see that all over nature, you see that over, you know, biological systems, and ultimately systems that we can say, you know, have an understanding of the world, know the world. But by overemphasizing the rules, overemphasizing the symbol strings, overemphasizing just how computations are made on representations, you're losing that interaction. And that interaction, the authors of this paper are claiming, is absolutely critical to how things learn, how things develop, how things evolve. So, another part of the paper, they say that not only is it overemphasized in a computer metaphor, but that loses, in that overemphasis, it loses what we call self-complexing properties. Which is going to be, you know, we'll talk about some in just a second, but this is going to be a very important aspect of natural systems. That natural systems, we say, can self-complex. They can make complexity out of simplicity, but the way that happens is through interaction, a very kind of, you know, precise interaction between constraints and dynamics, you know, between the putting the rod up and how the curtains are going to kind of unfold, the step cycle, and how the step cycle is constrained in a very, very small piece of those movements, okay? Because what we need to describe are biological systems that can learn, that can evolve, that can develop, and the purely computational approach certainly can come up with examples, or I guess, you know, algorithms of how things learn, algorithms of how things evolve. But in so doing, in keeping at an algorithmic rule-based level, it's going to ignore some of the critical properties of what truly happens in nature and how the discrete system kind of interacts with the dynamic properties that occur in nature all the time, okay? And what they say is, in this paper, is that the discrete systems, basically, they can't allow for new data to emerge out of the system. That, you know, certainly, you know, you can design computers to learn and that sort of thing, but it's different. It's a difference kind of adding new algorithms, adding, you know, kind of new rule systems in a computer versus allowing the computer to actually have enough, you know, kind of, you know, natural dynamic properties in it that it can allow for a truly new learning, or a truly new understanding, or a truly new system to actually evolve. Okay, so they can bring in new data, but the computer systems only can do so based on the original symbol set. You know, a chess-playing computer will still work with the components that allow it to play chess. It all of a sudden can't start, you know, painting a picture or something like that. And yes, you can move to another computer that can do that, but what you want and what you see in nature is true evolution, is true development, is true changes in the system. And the paper argues that cannot happen in a purely algorithmic sort of device. So let's continue with this a little bit and talk about what is needed for complexity to arise out of simplicity. And this is still a kind of important story, I think. It was something that kind of became very popular in the 90s, this notion of self-complexing systems, but you still see it all over the place. I just saw a really nice example of it the other day, and I can't remember what field it was in. I'll go back and look, but it's something that's considered, kind of very seriously. It is, it is in some ways, I think maybe we can say that statistical approaches, probabilistic sort of approaches to cognition may be influenced by this a little bit. We can come back to that in a second. But I think for now, let's kind of get just the bare bones of it. And the kind of notion was order out of chaos. So there was many books and magazine articles that you'd see in, kind of science magazines about order out of chaos. What does this exactly mean? What it means is that in natural systems, you can think of these systems as working at kind of two levels of processing again. One that is very chaotic, and that would be in the microstructure. And you would need that chaos in the microstructure to allow for order to occur in the macrostructure. So we're talking about statistical mechanics and stuff like that here, where you're talking about heating up something and seeing kind of all this fluctuational behavior in the microstructure that, given the right parameters and given the right kind of constraints that might be provided, like something like a discrete mode, you start to see order arise. And I've got some, very kind of flashy examples of this. One is called so these are called dissipative structures, often because of the large amount of dissipation that goes on in the kind of lower level, giving rise to kind of an ordered structure on a more macro level. The Baynard convection is one of the most famous ones, and I'll show you an example of this. Basically, it involves heating oil, and I can't remember if it's a specific type of oil or not, but it's heating oil in a way that kind of creates different temperatures among the layers of the oil. So, you basically, here, I can show you, you put it in a Petri dish like this, and you heat it up, and it takes a long time, but there's a way of heating it up, and I can't remember the details, but there's a way of heating it up so that there's different temperatures across different depths of the oil. And what you see at first is, a lot of kind of fluctuational behavior that seems kind of random. And then after a certain point, you see patterns in the oil that are hexagonal, I guess. That's what that's showing there. And then these hexagons start to rotate. And it's almost as if, the kind of dissipation that's going on at the, microscopic scale is kind of giving way to an order, kind of a structure at the macroscopic scale that you can actually see with your eye. And that's what this is showing here. There you go. They kind of undulate. You can see, if you look at it, that's kind of cool. You can kind of see them kind of folding and rotating. And they become, kind of very, I don't know, stable kind of geometric patterns that occur. And that's just from heating up the oil to the point where there's, so much energy transfer and all the kind of molecular chaos going on that it kind of breaks into order. Okay? It's kind of an odd idea that chaos can break into order, but this was one of the kind of prime examples that's discussed in all these books and all that sort of thing. The other example that's often discussed in this context, believe it or not, is termite nests. And there's a termite nest there. These are African termites that fly. And I should mention that I actually got to see some of these. I didn't see one this big, but I had a chance to go to Africa 3 years ago. And we went on a safari, of course. And at one point, the guy's driving us around, and we could see way down, the field there. There were elephants and zebras, and the kids were all excited and everything. And then I was looking to the side of the road, and I saw these termite nests. I go, "Whoa, stop!" He goes, why? And I said, termite nests. And we stopped, and I told the family the whole story of these termite nests and how they're built. They thought it was kind of cool, but they still wanted to get to the elephants. But this is like they get this tall, actually. When you see them, typically where I was, Masamara, there was much smaller termite nests. They were about, I don't know, 3-4 feet high or something like that, but they were still impressive given how they're built. So how are they built? Well, so I should mention what's inside here. And if you ever get a chance, if you ever go to Africa and get to see ones this big, certainly put your hand in it. And you probably won't want to, because now I'm going to tell you it's made out of termite dung, but it's still worth it, right? What you would see if you kind of looked into this is a really complex kind of nexus of caves and arches and domes and all these things. I mean, they can get very sophisticated in there. And what was thought is, oh my gosh, termites are, clearly very simple little animals, but they must have some sort of blueprint. They must have a representation in their little termite brains of what this thing should look like, and they all work until they get there, okay? So the idea that there's a blueprint is a very kind of discrete sort of interpretation, that there's an algorithm that allows them to get to the blueprint somehow in their little termite brains, and that absolutely is one explanation. But I don't think it's the correct explanation. I think that's been verified now with some experimental studies of how this is really done. The termites are as dumb as they seem. They're pretty small, and they have tiny little nervous systems. But what they can do is follow smell. Okay, they can follow gradients of pheromone, basically, and they can follow that. So they deposit at the strongest smelling site on part of the African field, and they will drop their droppings there, basically. And in so doing, they are actually adding more droppings, and therefore kind of adding to this pheromone, I guess you could say, network that kind of disperses out. Okay, so what their little programs, their constraints, their little algorithms are just telling them one thing. It's not to build this sophisticated nest system with caves and domes and arches, but instead something simple. Just fly to and deposit at the point of the strongest smell. And you can call that the macro state in a way. So this is their constraint. They're flying around and they want to drop their stuff, and they are really guided strongly by these pheromone gradients, and they'll kind of follow it. Say, oh, I smell some pheromone, and they'll fly to the point where it smells the strongest, basically, and they'll drop at that point. Okay, so it's a macro state. I mean, it can be observed. You can certainly watch this happen, and people, have taken videos of this sort of thing, and that's what occurs. So there's a macro state here, which is in a sense, kind of an ordered sort of behavior that's supported by high dissipation at a microstate. And that dissipation is a way of characterizing the pheromone gradient. So this is another example then of these self-complexing systems. And I'll talk more about the details of how this works in just a second. But it is this interaction of dissipation of the chemical, okay, the molecules going out based on the pheromone. What I mean here by gradient, by the way, is just that, it's going to be weaker as it moves away from the pile of poop, and stronger. The pheromone odor would be stronger at the point of where it's been dropped. Okay, so it's a gradient. It's it's like following. It's very simple, following a smell. You know, the same thing is true of sound. It goes out on gradient, right? And you can, if you're trying to find where a sound is in the dark, you move to where it's loudest. You can say yourself then is moving on a gradient, right? But in this case, you know, this is a really nice example of a microstate which involves a clear dissipation of energy here. This is chemical energy that then acts to constrain a behavior kind of on another level. And so here comes the termite. They fly, they drop there, okay? And at first it's random. I mean, if you first look at a part of the, you know, the desert, not desert, the, you know, the floor of the African veldt there, you see, you know, tiny little, you know, mounds. I mean, maybe even, you know, less than an inch high, and they're just scattered all over the place. And so what will happen typically is the termite will fly, say, from, I don't know, 100 feet away and recognize, oh, there's droppings here. And then when they get there, when they, you know, they see these random droppings, you know, they'll, you know, find one and drop on that one. And what that does is it then makes that little mound that much more smelly, which means that when other termites come in, they'll start dropping on that little mound too. And the more termites that drop, the more termites that are attractive. And that's what's meant by that's what I mean by autocatalytic here. You know, it just, you know, the more termites that are dropping in the area, the more that are attracted, the more that drop, the more that, you know, it kind of goes on and on like this. And so now what you're seeing is kind of a real structure, again, based on the kind of microstate of the dissipation that's occurring in the pheromone gradient here. And then what you see are these little pillars. And that's what I saw. I was lucky to see these little pillars started developing. Does that, I'm having trouble seeing what my slide says? I can't, oh, shoot. Can't see. Did I have this on there? Hold on a second, sorry. Yeah, there it is. Pillars develop, sorry. And that's what I was able to see. The pillars were starting to develop, and so you know when I have a picture of it somewhere, who doesn't want to take a picture of termite poop when you're on a safari? You know, they were about, I don't know, 1 foot to 2 feet high, and there were lots of droppings all around it. But you'd see these pillars kind of developing, and you know, certainly the pillars were fewer than the little points of dropping that were only, you know, a tiny bit high. But you know, you could see these things start kind of growing. And the idea here is the termite now comes in, it smells really strong, the pheromone's really strong, and then when they get to the kind of part of the field where it's you know, there's pillars, the pillars smell especially strong, and they will drop their stuff on the pillars, okay, which is pretty cool. Okay, now this next part's really clever. If there are two pillars that are relatively close to each other, what happens is the termites will be attracted initially to a point in between the two pillars. Okay, so here's one pillar, here's another pillar. And here I am, my little nose is the termite. And I'm coming in here, and at first, you know, from far away, the strongest smelling point is right in between them. And I'll do this. But then when I get here, it's like, oh, this isn't the strongest smelling point. It's this one, or this one, but I'll say it's this one. And because I'm coming to it from a center position, I will drop on the pillar, but towards the inside of the pillar. Okay, and the same thing if I end up, you know, coming in towards the center of it, say, oh, this one, yeah, okay, I'll drop right here. I will drop towards the inside of the pillar. Again, my nose is the termite. And what that will do is it will cause those two pillars, as they grow, to start curving a little bit, like this. And that is also autocatalytic. So they, you know, termites continue to smell from far away, they continue to smell the middle as the strongest point. But when they get here, say they're a little bit to this side, they'll drop over here. Or if they're closer to this one, they'll drop over here. And what that ultimately does is it causes these pillars to start curving up like this to develop arches. Okay, it's very cool. And the idea here is, and I don't really care too much about this term, but they're attracted to a point in between the two pillars at first. And what that ultimately will do is it will bend the pillars towards each other because they're dropping on the inside. okay, which is pretty cool. It bends the pillars and it creates just the arches. And you start seeing this. So what I was able to get a picture of were you know, a bunch of pillars, two of which started curving towards each other. I wasn't able to get a picture of anything further down in the process. But after these arches start developing, okay, they develop between sets of pillars, as you're seeing here, and then there's a new little what we'll call virtual attractor in between the tops of these arches. And what that ends up doing, if the tops of the arches are close enough, is that's how the domes start to develop, right? So you basically, if those archways are close enough, if the tops of those archways are close enough, you get kind of a floor with a dome on top of it. And all of this, and this is the important part, all of this is just based on the termites doing one thing. Well, two things, I guess. Flying to the point of strongest pheromone and dropping their stuff there. Okay, they are just flying along the gradient. And as they drop, they then change the gradient just enough that the next termites that come, you know, will drop in a different position. And this is this, I think, really elegant interplay of, you know, kind of this micro diffusion, this microstructure diffusion of the molecules diffusing in, you know, specific ways based on the constraints that the termites fly under. So you can think of the discrete mode being, you know, a part of the termites, you know, nervous system, telling them to fly to where it stinks and drop your stuff there. That's it. And everything else is a function of the natural dynamics of what's going on. And what these authors argue, well, let's actually, before we get to there exactly, let's yeah, so there's another picture of a finished termite mound. I wish I could have seen something that big. I did not. But what we're talking about here is a kind of an interaction between, you know, a microstructure of the diffusion of the molecules that are leaving the strongest scent area, and then the termites using that gradient, that kind of micro kind of dissipation to determine where to drop their dropping. So there's the macro behavior. And that interaction between, you know, this diffusion system and the termites flying in is going to change little by little as the structures change. And it's going to change the gradient, and that's therefore going to change, you know, how the termites fly in, and that's going to create a different macro structure. So it's this really, these things are based completely on this interaction between micro and macro and micro and macro levels. And that is kind of the hallmark property of these dissipative structures. Okay, so the arguments are that when you see complexity in nature, very often it is based on the interaction between something that's going on in a microstructure, you know, diffusion of scent molecules, you know, kind of stochastic properties in heated oil, and they give rise to macrostructure. And without this interplay of, you know, kind of the micro and macro structure levels, you can't have evolution. You can't have development. You can't have a system that becomes truly more complex, becomes something that it wasn't before. And that's what's argued in this paper, that a purely algorithmic approach doesn't consider the critical interplay that occurs in the natural dynamics of natural systems. And in our termite example, there's no internal blueprint needed for the termite to do this. And yeah, there are empirical validations of this kind of interplay being the basis of it. You can, you know, mess up the pheromone gradient, you can mess up the termites, things like that. It seems that this is the way it works. It's not that the termite has some blueprint. It doesn't have everything mapped out in an explicit rule system as a purely algorithmic approach might suggest. It's doing a dumb thing. It's flying to the stinkiest point and dropping its stuff but this beautiful interplay of the microstructure and macrostructure allows the nests to develop on their own, in a sense. Okay? That is missed by a purely algorithmic, by a purely computational approach. Okay? That's the point of this. And these self-complexing systems, and I'm trying to remember the one I saw most recently. Oh shoot, I should have taken some notes. They're used to describe flocking behavior. If you've ever seen any videos of that, schooling behavior of fish, herding behavior of animals. In fact, my brother used to work for Disney. Used to do computer animation, and actually he was the one that would write the software programs for the computer animators. And he didn't actually work on Lion King, but some of his good buddies down the hall did. And he would tell me how they did the herding. I don't know if you know about this. There's a the very famous scene, assuming you saw the original Lion King. I don't know if they did the same thing for the newer live action Lion King, but for the original, cartoon animation of the Lion King, there's that famous scene where Mustafa, is that his dad, falls down into a herd of what are they, bison or something like that? I can't remember. And he dies, and that's where Scar, rises to be king. The animation of that herding, very famously at the time, they made a big deal of this at the time, I remember, was done not by giving, or not by a kind of fully prescribed set of algorithms for how the bison moved. Okay. Instead, what they did is they kind of gave each modeled bison very simple constraints, which were to, I think they were try to match the speed of the bison that's closest to you and stay a certain distance away from that bison. Okay, so they they modeled the herding behavior by including these very simple constraints on how the animals were constrained to move, and then let the whole thing kind of go on its own naturally. Let's see, I can show you how that looks. Oh boy, is this going to work? Oh shoot. Oh, I guess these aren't working. Hold on a second. You're going to have to trust me. Oops, sorry. You guys seen these sort of things before? No, let me show you very quickly. Yeah, this should work. What the heck? I'm sorry, these are not showing right now. Shoot. I know how I can get them to work. Just give me a second here, everybody. If I quit PowerPoint, and for some reason, if I quit PowerPoint and reopen, it works, and I have no idea why. Okay. Just take a second. Sorry, everybody. Just give me a second here. Please work. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so let me show you then. Let me go back and I'll share this with you. This is just a nice example of that sort of thing where they give, oh shoot. They give basically constraints to how, in this case, oh man, just give me a second here. Sorry about this. Okay. They give constraints to how, in this case, these birds can move. And then I think fish too, they have fish schooling too. What the heck? Okay, here you go. Let me just show you this one. This is early computer animation of flocking and herding and schooling behavior. Okay, does this one work too? See if I can get this one to work. There you go. Yeah, these are just kind of practice models of this sort of thing. And you know, they have the birds fly around objects like a wall, that sort of thing. And none of these are not all precisely programmed. These movements kind of develop out of their own based on the constraints they're giving the birds, the model birds. So it's not like there's a leader or anything like that. It's not like they're all following the same bird. They just give the constraints of things like avoiding collision. As I said, don't stay within a certain distance of your neighbor, match velocity, remain close, but absolutely avoid collision with the other things. And then what they do is they if they want to be more precise, they give it the physics of flight or the physics of running if we're talking about bison and perceptual limits. And what they found is for The Lion King, they were absolutely able to make it very compelling and much more realistic than if they tried to say, have the bison all follow a leader, all follow the same sort of movements. It just looked like a much more natural sort of animation if they kind of modeled these things. They gave them very simple constraints and let the dynamics of the interaction, kind of simulated dynamics, of course, in this case, kind of unfold on their own, which was, I think, very interesting. Let me put this over here. Okay, I'm going to pin my, oh, I am pinned. Sorry about this. Okay. So what do we want to say about this? In all these examples, what we're talking about, again, is an interaction of the discrete and continuous mode. Again, the discrete mode in these examples would be the constraints they have on the modeled animals, whether the birds' flocking behavior or the bison's herding behavior. And by the way, they also do these things like on traffic patterns, to model traffic patterns. It's not like they kind of give each driver some sort of detailed plan on how they're going to be driving or something like that. They just do things like, say, move forward, try to match the speed of everybody else, try to stay so far behind people, and then they can predict where there's going to kind of be bunch ups in the traffic on the freeway, that sort of thing. So the point of all that is that it turns out that you can understand behavior not by kind of strict, kind of thorough algorithmic modeling of these things. Rather, you kind of use spare model or spare algorithms, spare rule sets, and then let things interact naturally. And typically, we don't talk about this in a computational approach to mind. We talk about it still as more or less a kind of strict processing system. Now, a couple of more things I want to say about this. This is actually going to help us provide some of the kind of, I guess, I don't know what I want to say, the spirit of the next theory we're going to talk about. This, in some ways, is at the heart of a connectionist theory where things aren't fully prescribed, but things kind of arise naturally out of the interactions of components, okay? The other thing I wanted to say about this had to do with Searle. John Searle at the time, remember we were discussing the Chinese room example last class, where he said something about only biological systems really having the ability to truly know, to kind of take that next step and truly understand the world. And we discussed that there's some controversy about whether even that's an important question. That's fine. But I think what Searle was arguing, and this was arguing before he knew very much about self-complexing systems. It was, I think, 10 years before these things got really popular. Is that there is this, there's something about the natural world that kind of changes the way that, quote, computations or algorithms are needed. That algorithms turn out to be a very kind of, I don't know, spare sort of constraint system on the way the dynamics kind of unfold in the natural world. And it is possibly, the interaction between these things, between the the dynamics of the natural world and the constraints, and therefore the microstructure and the macrostructure that allows for new things to emerge. You know, kind of self-emerging systems, self-complexing systems have at its heart the interaction of spare kind of constraints, spare rule systems that kind of harness the natural occurring dynamics that lie underneath, whether the dynamics are a step cycle or a diffusion of pheromone, or part of the DNA and all that sort of thing. So this might be, in fact, what Searle means by only biological systems. No, maybe self-complexing is a hallmark property of truly having a meaningful interaction with the world. Okay, and people have written about that as well. All right, any questions about this? This is a really interesting paper. I urge you to read it. I kind of went a little off on it, a little further on parts of it, but I think you'll find this really an interesting paper, and you'll want to read it for your final, certainly. But I want to move now into connectionism. So are there any questions on this before I do so?
It feels like, the self-complexity really comes from the randomness. Like something has to be random. That's my
right. There has to be a kind of a fluctuational component. Yeah, there has to be a fluctuation. And people have tried to understand. I mean, in a lot. This has been a really hot topic in kind of motor coordination, kinesiology, that sort of stuff. Because when you look at things like step cycles, as we were discussing them, when an animal moves from a walk to a trot or walk to a gallop or something like that, what you see as they start speeding up before they get into that next type of gait is, in fact, a kind of severe fluctuations in the movements themselves. They see kind of a lot of chaos in the coordination before it breaks into the gallop, that sort of thing. And so people have often used these sort of principles to understand motor behavior, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and it reminds. Oh, sorry, please.
Oh, I was just going to say that it's everything operates at resonant frequencies. So like that's like the walking speed that your body affords you.
Right.
And whenever you deviate from that resonant frequency, you have to like like you were saying, exert all this extra effort to deviate from that. And that's where that chaotic kind of stuff comes in.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you guys talk about it in your lab, Hunter? Is that something?
We talk about resonant frequency a lot and do some work on that. Yeah.
Very cool. Mac, were you going to say something else?
Yeah, something similar. Like the speech alignment effect really kind of reminds me of this thing. Yeah, like
in what way? This is really interesting. In what ways?
Yeah, like speech alignment is a perfect example of the it's some
of resonance.
Sorry.
Of resonance?
No. I'm talking about the speech alignment effect.
Right.
Yeah, like I think according to the interpretation of the motive theory of the speech, when we are perceiving others' speech, we are actually like rising the threshold. No, actually lower the not threshold. It's like there's a sub threshold activation of the neural system, right? So like the motor region is primed, so it can like affect our speech production. Right.
That's absolutely correct. That's the motor theory interpretation of that. And how do you see that relating to? Is it relating to resonance? Is that what you're suggesting? Or
no, not really related to resonance. Yeah, it's related
to self-complexing.
Kind of, but not really. It's like the essence of these kind of things might originate from something like the basic unit is not binary. Like it's the neurons are integrated fire models. It's not totally binary, right? It can like first integrate and then fire. It's not just 1 and 0. Yeah, it's like.
I understand. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, I should mention that it's interesting. There have been dynamic system interpretations of things like speech alignment. I have a very good friend who has done a lot of research on coordination between people, where he can manipulate kind of the coordinative state between people. You know, you can have them. Actually, what they do is they we'll talk about this later on in the quarter, but they swing pendula like this as they face each other. And they're told to at first swing it out of phase. And so when one person has they face, you know, imagine I'm facing somebody who also is doing this. And at first, when I have mine back, he has his back like this. And when I have mine forward, he has his forward. That would be out of phase. And then we're told to speed up as we do this. And then what happens after a while is we break into in-phase coordination, where when mine's back, his is forward, like, so they end up like this. Okay, and it's very similar to what happens, you know, if you try to do this with your own fingers and you speed up, eventually you end up kind of moving into a gallop or moving into a trot. So that happens when, you know, and I go faster, and then I'm in phase, right? That happens. But what's really interesting, when I do that, or when an animal moves from a trot to a gallop or something like that, there are these kind of idiosyncratic fluctuations you see in the behavior, you know, in terms of the amount of energy that's dispersed right before you break into it. That also happens between people. Okay, those sort of changes happen between people as well. Those sort of kind of fluctuational behaviors, and a lot of other properties that are known to be, you know, true of you know, within a person's coordinative system, including things like hysteresis. You know what that is? Like when you break into that new mode, if you then slow down, eventually you will go back into the original mode, but it takes a while. That's the hysteresis. It takes longer to get, you know, you have to go to a slower speed. All those properties that seem to work within a person's limbs work across people's limbs too. And so when you see imitative sort of behaviors, which is, you know, a lot of our behaviors, as we discussed, have an imitative component when we're interacting, those could be based on the sort of coordinative systems that are involved in coordinating interlimb behavior within a single person. You know, where the kind of fluctuations that are occurring on the, you know, kind of the muscular level, all that sort of thing, give rise to these new, you know, kind of macro states. So yeah, I mean, people have absolutely done you know, models of speech perception that take into account the self-complexing of coordinating systems.
Yeah, so there goes like a related question for me. Like, how do the binary chips implement the neural networks?
How do the what? Say that again.
The binary chips, or like the machine, the binary machine.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. So right.
Yeah.
So yeah, actually, that's a great question. And can I save that for our discussion on connectionism? It is relevant, and I'm glad that you're asking it now in a sense, because you're anticipating the connection of these sort of systems to the connectionist approach, and how the connectionist approach can be possibly seen as compatible with a computational approach. Yeah. No, it's a great question for now. I'm just going to save it for later. Okay, are there other questions at this point? Okay, let me go ahead and switch then. And I assume you guys have had some introduction to connectionism, but I'll start off slow, and it will allow us to, oh, hold on a second. Oops. Oh, right, I closed PowerPoint. Okay. So I'm going to start off slow and kind of just go slow introduction to it. Share screen. There we go. Good. So here's a little rhythm at the beach. Oh yeah, gotta do this too. So I assume you've had some introduction to connectionism at some point. Oh my gosh. All right, no one panic. There it is. We actually have talked a little bit about a parallel processing system before. We briefly mentioned this kind of what's called the pandemonium model. We used it to understand feature analysis. And that's what we're going to be discussing with Connectionism, is a parallel processing system. But one of the things I wanted to do, one of the things I made this, when I portrayed it as such a simple system, is because what I want to be able to do is tweak it a little bit and show how, with some fairly minor adjustments, this becomes a much more powerful system. So we discussed this, as I said, in the context of feature analysis. And let me just do a quick review for you. We talked about this type of system as an example of a hierarchy, meaning there was a one-way flow of information. There was no communication. The flow of information in this model goes from the bottom to the top. There was no communication across units that existed in a given level. So in this model, R has no communication with K and no communication with P. And then these units don't have any communication either. The communication only occurs between levels. There's a centralization. I'm just going down these characteristics here. There's a centralization in that this unit up here kind of makes the final decision. Or if we're talking about, by the way, speech production or language or motor behavior or something like that, this little unit would be the one that would make the ultimate, or I guess the initial command that would then be enacted by limbs, units that stood for limbs and muscles and all that sort of stuff. But we've been talking about it in the context of perception. So we talk about it as making a decision, a centralized decision, and that dominance does not change. The units can't affect each other backwards. In other words, so this is kind of just the same way of saying there's just a one-way flow of information, and then each of the units only does a single thing. So these units represent features in the input. These units represent something like templates, kind of very generalized and more powerful templates. And then this guy has the function of just making the decision. A couple of other things I wanted to mention about this, though, is that we are just talking about excitatory connections here. And I bet you may have thought about this when I first presented this. There's no degree to which these units are inhibiting each other, either within a level or across the levels. They're only telling each other that, hey, there's evidence for me in the image. So imagine, again, you're looking at the letter R. The system is looking, it's a I guess a script reading machine in the post office, or like a zip code reading machine, and it's looking for an R, though, in this case, or it's seeing an R. The input is an R, and these units are saying, hey, I see a straight vertical line. K, I'm telling you that it could be me. R and P, we all have that in common, and I'm going to get excited about that. The same thing here with a curve line. It's telling P, yep, it could be us. R, it could be us. And it's not telling anything to K. It could be inhibiting K, but in this case, it's only conveying its energy through excitatory sort of influences, right? There could be another line from here that went to K that was marking an inhibitory sort of influence, right? Because it's seeing a curve, it can tell K, hey, it probably isn't you. And of course, that could be, you folks, I'm sure, have seen the notation of when there's an arrow, it's meant to indicate excitation very often. When there's a dot, it's meant, at the end of it, it's meant to indicate inhibition. But these are all excitatory as we first portrayed it. And I want to make sure we take note of that. Again, just a couple of other things I already mentioned, which is one-way flow of information and no intra-level communication. And so what we're going to do now is tweak all these things just a little bit. And by doing so, we're going to end up, as I said, with a much more powerful sort of system that can do potentially a lot of things that we've been trying to do with more strict computational approaches. Okay? So we're going to add to this system inhibitory connections. And just like I said before, we're going to notate them with these little dots on the end. So here it is exactly what I was talking about. This curve not only excites the P unit and the R unit to say, hey, it could be you guys because I see myself in the image and you have that as part of your, shape. It also can tell K, K, you don't have the curve that I am. And therefore, I'm going to tell you, yeah, it might very well not be you. It's going to then suppress the amount of, I guess, activation of K, which is something that the decision unit would take into account. And then we can also talk about top-down information, right? So if I just now added another level where the system is not just looking at single letters, it's looking at multiple letters, and it's trying to form words at the same time. So as say there, if the possible word is the word red, if there's evidence for E and D, then without having determined that this is the letter R yet, it can feed back and say, R, the second and third letter are E and D, and so R, it absolutely could be you because we know that's a word, right? Where that might be a different sort of influence for K as an example. It also shows an excitatory influence here. Now, importantly, these sort of models do get kind of idiosyncratic about where there is top-down information. It's okay. I'm not going to define anything right now. You see there's no top-down information going from the letter units to the feature units, and that's fine. In some models there might be, in others there might not be. That's okay. You can play with that. But just allowing, in principle, there to be top-down information is something that's going to be critical to kind of freeing this sort of model up to do some pretty amazing things. And then finally, we're going to allow for intra-level communication. And I actually don't have an example of that on this particular image here, but I can show you one that does. There you go. That's a nice one. It's one of the first ones they show, I think, in the connectionist, original connectionism books. It's the same thing we were just looking at, more or less, where you have feature units down here and letter units here. And now you have word units up here like we had just added. And we are allowing there to be top-down influences. So trip is influencing down here. The top-down, again, don't go from the letter to the features. But again, that's not critical. Some models have them, some don't. But what is critical is the intra-level communication you see here between the units. So if there's more and more evidence for A, then N might be suppressed, activity for N. This is, okay, so let's talk about it now, looking at the letter for T. And I should make this very clear that this would be really what we're talking about here in trying to interpret T. Then words are going to play a role here, but these words are obviously going to have input from other parts of the word, to determine whether the second letter is an R or B or whatever, and the third letter is an I or a K or whatever. Okay, so what's activating all of these up here is also going to be influenced by other systems. But what's important here is that there can be inhibition. Most often it's inhibition between these units that are representing what letter we might be looking at any one time. And in this case, it would be a T. So T saying, oh my gosh, I'm getting a lot of activation for me. So I'm going to tell N and A and G and what is that, an S, that it might not be you guys. And I'm going to have you guys quiet down a little bit because the more activation I see for myself, I'm going to tell you to be quiet. The same thing's happening up here with the word units. So, clearly we have, a whole bunch of new features here that we've added. And these changes, plus a few other principles, are really going to, I guess, release a certain degree of, I would say almost magic. I keep on using this word, but it's almost as if the system kind of takes on its own life and emergent properties start to appear. And I'll talk about what I mean about that in just a second. But this is kind of the heart of connectionism. So let's talk about what type of properties that we're going to be able to add to at these just a little bit, but this kind of is the heart of a connectionist model in a lot of ways. And in connectionism, the idea is this, that the processing is based on an interaction of simple units, right? We're not talking about, kind of algorithms and flow charts, like if this happens, then do this, then if that happens, then do this. We're talking about units that represent pieces of something that might be perceived or things that might be understood, things that might involve motor coordination and action, all these sort of things. And by the activation of these simple units and their influences on each other, the system kind of settles on a solution. I've always liked this idea of settling on a solution in connectionist theory. That, if it were seen in slow motion, you would see the influences, if you say there's a light whose brightness is associated with each of these units, you'd see the lights all being equally dim at first, and as the information starts coming in, you see some lights get brighter of these units and some lights get dimmer of these units, and eventually, after all these influences occur on each other, I'm doing it very slowly now, the system kind of settles and determines that the first letter is T. And this idea of settling, I think, is very consistent with what we discussed in the context of Gestalt psychology as a solution relating to equilibrium. Remember this kind of really nice metaphor of the system kind of gets mixed up and then kind of settles down into an equilibrium state that's associated with the solution. So kind of bringing our equilibrium and our field theoretic understanding of the brain, of cognition that we first saw in the context of Gestalt, we can bring it in here, I think, nicely. Okay, and people who discuss connectionist models will talk about kind of reaching a solution, settling on a solution, and they'll use terms like equilibrium sometimes. But what's critical here is that this is not a system that uses explicit rules or algorithms. We're not looking at that type of system here. We're looking at something that might be much more consistent with emergence of solutions and settling on solutions. It's not an explicit sort of, if do this, then if this happens, then this happens, then this happens. It's not a flow chart at all. It's rejecting that idea. It's rejecting kind of explicit rules that we often attribute to mental life, that we've been discussing in the context of the computational approach. So, as you'll see in this history, connectionism is, in some ways, the development of a theory that is a very striking alternative to a computational, kind of a purely rule-based computational sort of approach. Let me just step back and say we are kind of still talking about computation in some ways, but it's a different type of computation than the sort of approach that was discussed as we went through computation. Okay? We'll talk more about that to make sure you understand the idea. Another really... Go ahead.
If the connections between the nodes are hard-coded, they're just kind of created that way and they don't really change, is that itself kind of like an algorithm?
They're more like an algorithm. The nice thing for connectionism, of course, is that they do change, right? This is a hallmark property of connectionist systems, that the connection strengths change with experience. The connection, so it's not like a new algorithm appears, I don't think. Instead, we're talking about the pieces of the representation having different relationships to them based on experience. This is a theory that really is driven in some ways by, experience, dependent change, learning, evolution in some ways, unlike the computational approach. I mean, certainly the computational approach, a strict computational approach, had explanations for how learning occurs, but this one, this theory is completely dependent on experience in some ways. I mean, in some ways, it can almost be contrasted as an empiricism versus a more nativistic sort of computational approach. If you want to go that route, this is really based on experience, where unit activation is dependent on how the units have been activated before. So here I've got this little kind of animation. So let me see, how do I want to say this here? Say there's a unit, we'll call this the unit, since we were talking about t's, we'll call this the unit for the horizontal line of the t, and this unit as the vertical line of a t. And every time the system sees a t, it's going to certainly activate a unit that is responsive to a horizontal line and a unit that is responsive to a vertical line. Now, having experienced its first t, the connection between these units is going to change subtly. So I've just kind of notated that by increasing the thickness of this bar between the units. Cool. So the next time a horizontal line is seen in a letter, say it's a horizontal line towards the top of the image, okay, bink, it is going to activate this unit for a vertical line faster because of the nature of this connection that changed based on the previous experience of seeing a t. And that further now increases the activation between the units, making that line a little thicker. And so again, horizontal line, bam, now it's going faster. See, this line's thicker than all the other lines that are in here now. So yeah, it could certainly activate all these other units, but the activation of the unit that's representing the vertical line is going to be stronger and faster, which actually increases the connection strength between them even more. And it just goes on like that, okay? So what happens is the activation between units and also, as you'll see, collections of units, which we'll be talking about, is dependent on prior experience. Okay, so two units are fired off at the same time. The connection between those units will strengthen. It's kind of related to Hebb's law. We'll talk more about that later. The idea that this may be how learning occurs when we talk about neurons, right? The connection between the neurons is strengthened as experience kind of activates these neurons simultaneously. That sort of thing. So that is absolutely critical to this theory. That is one of the things that the theory is built on. That the connections, that there are units that have connection strengths that are modified by experience. It's absolutely critical. The other thing I wanted to say about this is that we can talk about units as representing things like features, but we can also kind of loosen up that a little bit too, because what we want is a certain flexibility in the system such that the units can represent items or pieces of items, okay? And actually, I want to be a little bit more precise here. I'm not sure that's the best way of saying it, but let me just say this, that when you start talking, yeah, so say we have this. So I kind of portrayed this as representing a horizontal feature. But it doesn't have to be a single unit that represents that horizontal feature. It can be multiple units that represent the horizontal feature. Something like this, right? So these units are actually the units that are representing a multiple, the horizontal line, okay? And it's only when these units are activated together that the system is reacting appropriately to the horizontal line, okay? The important part is, though, that any one of these units can participate in more than one representation, meaning that this could be the representation of the horizontal line in a letter, and this could be the representation of your mom's nose. I mean, anything, really. You would hopefully want it to be something related to letters, but that's okay. And you can see there is that one unit there that is participating in two representations. And you can probably anticipate where this is going to go. The idea is potentially that this is going to be something that's closer to what might be happening in the nervous system. But the connectionists are very careful to say, we can just set up this model even without, at least initially seeing if this is how the nervous system works. That's something down the line. But we want to show you that it can have these properties and provide these cognitive solutions without, kind of saying anything about the nervous system at this point. So we're just going to talk about these as units right now. And they want to make the important point is that unit, any unit, can participate in more than one representation. And it's important for you to understand, I kind of actually wish I hadn't said it this way. It's not like this is T and this is for the word tap or something, or tape, right? This is actually a different possibility of how a horizontal line might be represented. So I guess, yeah, all right, let me just keep it like that, right? I mean, it doesn't really make a difference. It could be a configuration. It can be a certain collection of units that can represent these features, okay? Unlike how we're doing it kind of in this model here. Meaning that these units can have multiple responsibilities. They can participate in more than one representation. That's what's needed for the for the horizontal line in a T to be represented, and that's what's needed for your mommy's nose to be represented. And look at, yep, there's a unit that has double duty, but that's okay, because these representations can be distributed. And that's another term you're going to see in the reading, that representations can be distributed across units. And we're talking about representations even of things like low-level features. That's perfectly fine. Connectionism wants to have that flexibility in how it kind of conceives of representations instantiated in these units, basically. So that's another way in which we're kind of moving away from that original pandemonium model with that little, decision guy on top, saying, oh, that's the letter R, okay? We're allowing the units actually to have more than one function, okay? And so the representations then can be distributed across units, which is why you often see this term associated with connectionism. And sometimes it's associated with specific types of connectionist models. And later on, we'll talk about that there are some connectionist models, at least initially, that had this property and some that didn't. But for all intents and purposes, right now, we can say that this is potentially a property connectionist systems can have. The representations, even as something like low-level features, can be distributed over units. So it's often called the parallel distributed processing system. The processing all occurs in parallel. It's not, serial, much more like a kind of classic computational system would be. It's all happening in parallel, and it can involve representations that are distributed across units, which is an important function. Based on that now, actually, this is a good place to stop, because then we can use the next slide as a little summary to come back and then kind of use it as a jumping off place to talk about other characteristics of connectionist systems. But I'll take some questions if anyone has any questions. I know this is kind of, the fundamental low-level stuff, but if you guys have questions, I'd be happy to answer them now.
What about put these connected neurons or nodes actually into a single box of the original computational theory?
Could they be part of this? Oh, yes. Are you asking, are we maybe just looking inside, by conceiving of a connectionist model, are we really just looking inside the box of a computational flowchart? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah. I will answer that next class. It's a great question, and it's one of the criticisms of a connectionist theory as an alternative to a computational theory, that maybe we're really just looking at the microstructure of a computational model.
Yeah, I think it's something similar to put the Chinese room into the robot's head. Kind
Oh,
of
that's
like-
interesting. Okay, very cool. Well, definitely remind me of that when we talk about that next class. That's a great point. So, other questions at this point? Okay, let's just take a quick 10-minute break and come back and continue to talk about this stuff. Hey. I think that Gardner's here again, so if it gets really noisy, I might have to stop just for a second. Good timing, as always. All right. Let's continue. Oh, any questions before I do? No? Okay. Oops. All right, good. Oh, is Michael here? That's okay. Can you guys hear the Gardner? No?
Just barely.
Okay, good. That's why I put a microphone here. If the microphone's on the computer, I don't know, you guys aren't teaching now, but when you do, it picks up a lot more of the ambient sound. If you get like a $20 microphone, it helps a lot. Okie dokie. So, connectionism, yes. So yes, let's just do this review slide. We pretty much all talked about all this stuff, but it's a useful little thing to quickly do. We are now considering the difference between a heterarchy and hierarchy. And the hierarchy just is, this is just the prime example of the hierarchy. And we can, you have hierarchies in government, and the structure of the university works on a hierarchy, where the big cheese is the chancellor and all that sort of stuff. But a hierarchy is the sort of system that I think best characterizes the connectionist models. Those, we have the two-way flow of information, and this top-down information is, very critical. And again, it can certainly be tweaked. Don't think of this as the only connectionist system. There are many connectionist systems where there are models, connectionist models, I should say, where there are influences between something like a letter template level and the feature level. That's fine. This is just one example of a connectionist model. The intra-level communication, though, is really important. It needs to be on at least some of the levels, if not most of the levels. That's a really critical aspect of it, because it's going to involve both excitation inhibition, which we've discussed, decentralization, and this turns out to be very important too. And later on, we'll discuss whether or not this is something that bears on a homunculus problem. Here it almost seems like we have a kind of cartoon version of a homunculus that looks down to see which of these units is making the most noise. And by kind of getting rid of this centralization of control or of I don't know, agency, the system kind of settles on solutions, and possibly that will in some ways address the problem of a homunculus that then isn't kind of imparted with the same sort of mental capacity or cognition that we're trying to explain to begin with, by allowing the system to kind of, you would never say something like a homunculus exists in a magnetic field or something like that, and that's why it has the shape it does, or a homunculus exists in a termite nest, and that's why you have the structure it has. So can we talk about these systems as being kind of equilibrium, kind of more emergent systems, as being less subject to the difficult aspects of the homunculus problem that we were talking about before. But we'll get into that a little bit later. The dominance can change here, and that is kind of part of the fact that there is a two-way flow of information. So in other words, we can talk about, these imparting an influence, these units up here imparting an influence on these, and these imparting an influence on those. So the dominance is kind of constantly changing here. It's not, yes, these might have a certain degree of sophistication that these do, and the degree to which the influence can occur might depend on the level, but it's being open to the possibility that dominance can change, and the influences can work both ways at least. And then this idea of there being each unit is kind of so single. This is actually a functional pluripotentiality is a fancy way of saying units do not have a single function, at least in terms of the parallel distributed processing versions of this. So if you look down on your feature analysis old slide there where I was portraying the hierarchy, the last characteristic is a single function node, that the nodes always have a specific function and that function doesn't change. That is not the case with at least most of the connectionist systems we'll be talking about. It is, as I said, most of the systems will be portrayed as having distributed representations across a series of nodes. Like, think back to the letter T's horizontal feature being represented by a collection of nodes. One of those nodes is actually participating in a collection of nodes that represents your mom's nose. Okay, that sounds terrible, your mom's nose, but you get the idea. It can be completely different representations potentially. So that's what's meant by functional pluripotentiality, that any one unit can have the potential to participate in more than one kind of function. That's all that fancy term means. Okay, so after kind of establishing all these things early in the original kind of presentation of what connectionist models were like, they then do talk a little bit about these possibly being more neurophysiologically tenable. Meaning that at this time, certainly, we had a sense that, you know, there was probably nothing like a cell that represented one and only one thing, at least not higher up in the brain, right? We got this sense that representations of things usually involve collections of cells, so that functional pluripotentiality is more neurophysiologically tenable, at least in some neurophysiological accounts. And for that reason, in neurophysiology, they started talking about neural networks, and which had connections to, you know, comprised of cells that had connections to each other, and those connections could change with experience. So at least in terms of kind of the degree of flexible changes that can occur with within groups of neurons, representations being spread across groups of neurons, this, at least on a first pass, does seem to characterize what we more modern theories of what's going on neurophysiologically at the cellular level. The idea behind hierarchical sort of computational models was that there would be units for different templates, you know, be cells for different templates. It was the idea that we would have a cell that would represent your grandmother's face from a very specific perspective, you know, at a specific age, all that sort of thing. And what they're saying here is that these are kind of more flexible representations, and part of that flexibility comes from how the cells between each other can the activity that occurs between the cells can change within a neural network, and how the representation is certainly spread across the network. Okay, so at least on a first pass, it does seem more neurophysiologically tenable than at least, I guess, more classic theories of computation, more photo-oriented theories of computation certainly suggested. Okay. What other appealing aspects does it have? Well, this flexibility, this degree of flexibility does seem to buy a lot. Okay. You know, the computational models that we have discussed had a certain kind of rigidity to them. They, you know, they were all or none, yes, no sorts of systems, right? And yes, there are, you know, ways of you know, kind of wedding certain flexibility aspects of connectionist systems to more classic computational systems. But this kind of, by portraying them as quite distinct now, will help us understand other aspects of connectionism then we'll go back and see if they can be modified to be more compatible, these two theories. Okay? So one appealing aspect is something called graceful degradation. And the idea is this: whether the stimulus, whether the input is degraded in some way, or the system itself is degraded in some way. The aspects of connectionism that we've just laid out will allow it to handle this degradation gracefully. In other words, it will give the best possible solution, even if it doesn't have the optimal system makeup anymore or the optimal input anymore. And this is very clearly a byproduct of there being activations that are partial, right? Activations change over time. And so we're not talking about all or none sort of, yes-no systems. We're talking about activations which are partial and can change and are dynamic as the system experiences, different types of stimuli and different types of behavior and that sort of thing. It's not binary, yes, no. It is based on the relative strengths between units, and that has a flexibility. So we can think of things like perceptual completion. And perceptual completion, very simply, is like if you're given a stimulus like this, where in theory you wouldn't know what that last letter is because of the smudge on it. Okay, that's okay because of the way a connectionist system is set up. All the kind of top-down information, all the kind of activation that kind of grows over experience can allow this system to have the flexibility to determine what that last letter is. So this is just kind of a way of showing how a model might work on something like this, and it's just showing, assuming it's this type of model again, we have a letter level, and then we have a word level up here, and over time, as the letter level is trying to determine what this last letter is, but we know that as this is occurring, as it's trying to determine what this last letter is, other parts of the system are determining what these other letters are, and so that's kind of feeding up to the word level. And so, based on prior experience of seeing a W followed by an O followed by an R, right? There are a certain number of possibilities that kind of fall out based on the, I guess, the experience-driven levels of activation for each of those words, right? So, it's like a rule that the units that stand for the W, the O, and the R in that order kind of get strengthened over time because we've seen words that have those three letters in front followed by a finite set of letters afterwards. And it's not having to make decisions based on, whether it's a word or non-word. It doesn't have the rules of kind of spelling, the orthographic rules of spelling or something like that kind of inscribed in it. Rather, it's just experience, seeing these three letters in a row, kind of supporting the representation for different words based on them strengthening the connection between them and between the three letters in a row and the words. And then that providing kind of the top-down information to determine that it's likely, based on the features that are available to it, that the last letter of this is work. And so it can handle perceptual completion based on, again, the kind of experience-based activation between these letters that are being established and between these letters and the word level units that are being established, and then the word level units that are being established going ahead and playing a role in determining what this feature might be or what this letter might be. Do you understand that? I'm not being very precise about it, but hopefully you get a sense that there's the degree of flexibility that allows there to be different levels of activation, not an all or none sort of thing, allow it to make a determination of what this letter is, and in fact, what this feature might be is a K, a little, I guess, slanted line up here or whatever, because of the past experience kind of activating these things together more and more every time you see the word work. And that's, of course, activating the word work, which is activating from the word level units, activating down into the letter units and the feature units. Does that make sense? So it's the gradations of activity that are based on experience that allow it to handle this gracefully. Okay? That's what's meant by graceful degradation here. There can be a degradation in the stimulus. And there's some great examples of this that go beyond letters. One of the phenomena I work with in my lab is called phonemic restoration, I guess it's often called. And I don't have an example of this, unfortunately, but I think I can explain it to you so you understand what it is. It started with this kind of serendipitous observation where somebody, a guy who was listening to, who was a scientist, a speech scientist, was listening to I guess, something like C-SPAN or something, and was listening to people talk about the legislature and what needed to be done. And right when the person said legislature, the word legislature, another colleague next to him coughed, so that the cough completely covered up the S in legislature. As it turns out, what they could do is what he realized is that, in fact, you can remove a phoneme, you can remove a speech sound segment, like S in this case, and replace it with a noise, replace it with a cough, and people won't notice that it's missing. And so what he did is he took the recording, he went back to the lab, he actually took the word legislature that somebody else had spoken in the lab, he recorded it himself maybe, and then removed the S. And if you remove the S, you do hear there's something weird about it, that's no problem. But if once you fill it in with a noise, you fill it in with a cough, any sort of sound, people don't notice it's gone. In fact, people can't even tell you that there was a cough during the S versus a cough during the G or a cough during the U or the R or something like that. They'll say, oh yeah, I heard a clear word legislature and I heard a cough. Where was the cough? I don't know. Somewhere in the word, and they would guess wrong often. And they wouldn't know that the S was actually extracted out if there was something else there. It's kind of it's kind of like this, I suppose. Yeah, maybe it's very similar to this example here, but with speech sounds. And then that S has this kind of perceptual reality to it that can actually do things like induce adaptation effects. So people, it's not only that you have a phenomenal experience of hearing the S still there, your brain kind of interprets the S as being there to the extent that it can affect other sorts of speech sounds later on and stuff like that. It's a really interesting effect. Anyway, it can be explained, and often is explained, with the same sort of idea that the speech system works on kind of activations across phonemes and across words and phonemes and potentially phonemes and whatever features are reliable, as we know that's an issue, but whatever features are being used, such that the kind of gradations in activation between these units, as we've experienced over time, as they've changed over time, allow for there to be a degradation, in this case, in the auditory stimulus, that still allows us to perceive the word and then fill in the missing segment, in this case, S. So it is a pretty compelling example, I think, of graceful degradation. But it doesn't just have to be a degradation in the stimulus. There's examples. This is a very, what's his name? Oh God, I can't remember the guy. The very famous guy who is Gage, Phineas Gage, who had the pole through his head and had very severe brain lesions. But other brain lesions, where you do see problems that you would expect to be worse than they actually are. It's thought that a lot of these recoveries and kind of I guess graceful ways of the brain handling it, the degradation in this case of the system, is again a function of the partial activations, the graded activations that change over time. So So again, whether the degradation is from the stimulus or the degradations in the system itself. Maybe if you're in college and you over imbibe every weekend or something like that, you're degrading your brain a little bit. The degradation still is handled as gracefully as hopefully it can, based on these gradations in activation that again are affected by experience. So there's a degree to which the flexibility is kind of core. This flexibility in these systems is core to the theory. That's not true of a more classic computational system that would potentially have more trouble. Computers, crash. Computers break down. Of course, the electronics break down, but also the software breaks down. And the idea is that if we can have a biological system that has these characteristics of everything I've just listed in heterarchies plus the partial activation and all that stuff, then we can explain how biological systems can deal with lots of messy stimuli and lots of messy brains in some ways in a graceful way. Okay, that's graceful degradation. What else? Oh yeah, okay. So then you're thinking, okay, so what about nonsense words? So what we're going to continue talking about, I think this is actually really interesting. And I actually alluded to it a tiny bit on the previous slide. What about nonsense words? And so this would be our nonsense word today. And if I asked you what it said, what is likely this word? I think, many of us would say, oh, it's probably yeed. It's probably the word yeed, even though, which is not a word, it's a nonsense word. If I had to make a guess, I would say it's the word yeed. Okay, so what's going on here? And you could say that, well, the reason I would say it's yeed is because there's a rule system my brain has that knows the orthographic spelling rules such that if I have a Y and then an A and D with a missing letter before the A, the spelling rules would suggest that E would be the likely candidate, right? The E and A are very common vowel clusters, right? If it's a second letter after a Y, it's going to probably be a vowel, right? You can't think of too many English words that have a Y and then a consonant following it. So we have that rule too. And those rules are, in a sense, what you would assume from a more classic computational perspective, that whether it's something that is, whether that particular algorithm was something you were born with, or it was obviously this one is going to be language specific, so it's something that's acquired. You acquire an explicit rule that tells you how to spell, okay? It might not be a conscious rule, of course, but it's going to have a bearing on how you're going to interpret words, even if they're not real words, so we can make sense of them, okay? However, this is important. What a connectionist modeler would say is that you can still show that yeed would be the interpreted word without there ever being explicit rules in the system. The system does not need to know the rules of spelling. It doesn't need to know the rules of whatever, phonology or whatever, so that some things are pronounceable, some things are not. It's just the system's experience. It never needs to actually, create a rule that it then reapplies and reapplies and reapplies. It's just the system's experience, and importantly, the experience as it pertains to the connections between units that allows it to do this. And don't worry about these details, but it's the same thing we just saw, the same type of thing we just saw, except with new letters and new words. This is over time, and this is instantaneous, of course, but they're stretching it out here so you can see how the relative activation of these letters could change, and so this could be a C, right? I mean, everything that it's shown here, it could be a C. Certainly, it could be an F too, I guess, couldn't it? Yeah. So C and F are very real possibilities based on the features. However, based on how these letters follow one another, okay, in our experience, based on how these letters follow each other in experience, based on the words that these letters typically comprise, they're all going to be activated so that words that have a second letter of E are going to be activated and going to play a role in determining what that second letter is. And again, what's critical here is that there's no rule system in here. I mean, the system can act like it has a rule, but it doesn't. It's just how we've experienced these words and experienced these letters together, and how the connections between the units that represent the letters, the units that represent the words, are changed over time, that allows this letter to be interpreted as an E without having the explicit rule. So it acts as if it knows the rule. It knows that that E comes before A, or it has that it has an explicit rule to know that it's a vowel that comes after Y and that sort of thing. But it's not an explicit rule. It's never explicitly stated. Instead, the solution is something that's kind of settled on. It kind of reaches this equilibrium. It emerges from the possible solutions as the most likely solution. And that's a more parsimonious way of going about it in some ways, right? What I mean by that is, it would be nice if we didn't have to, keep adding new algorithms onto the cognitive structure here, so that if a lot of these things can kind of emerge naturally, if the solutions can emerge naturally just based on these low-level constraints and these simple interactions of components, that's cool. That's really nice. I mean, that's something that physics wants, right? Physics wants to find the most parsimonious explanations of magnetic fields and all that fancy stuff. And wouldn't it be nice if the cognitive system could do this too? And remember, we're kind of thanking our friends now, Wertheimer and Kafka and Kohler, those Gestaltists, saying, "Hey, listen, this if we can find solutions out of simple interactions, out of laws that hold not just for psychology or computers, but really hold on other levels of nature, that's an attractive way of solving this problem." And that's a very connectionist idea. It's the simple kind of interaction of very simple units that might make it seem like the system knows rules, but instead is really just based on the interaction and the changing interaction of these simple units, which I think is a very cool thing. I'm going to show you some other examples of this, because they talk a lot about this, the connectionism. Folks, they say there are a lot of examples in language, but in other things too, where rules seem to be running the system. There's no question that there are explanations where rules run the system. But before we get there, this is actually a nice place to talk a little bit about learning, but it should be very obvious in what I've been saying. Learning occurs in this system. It's absolutely critical part of the system. It occurs based on how the connectionists are changed through multiple associations. And when I say strengthened, I don't necessarily mean, I've been discussing it in terms of activation, but it's certainly an inhibition. The inhibitory relationship between the units can be strengthened as well. Okay, so those are going to change with experience. And what they're saying is a byproduct of processing activity. I mean, this is just what happens, as things are experiencing. There's this change of activation between the units, whether they're change in, I guess, how do I want to say? What's the general? It could be inhibition or activation between the units, just as a function of experiences, multiple experiences. So it's a byproduct of the activity between the units. And again, the point here is that's all that's going on. That explicit. Oops, shoot. Sorry, I don't know why that happened. Are you guys still with me? Yes?
Yeah.
Thank you. Good. Because my computer just all of a sudden, the screensaver went on and I had to log back in. Good. Okay. So it's the same story. No explicit rules are really needed in these cases, and that's a really attractive thing. It'd be nice if we didn't have to, keep adding, explicit rules to the system. It'd be nice if these behaviors could just emerge out of the simple interaction of these units, right? And so this is another great example, I think, that what we call acquisition errors in language, and my kids certainly did this. I think most kids do. What we call sometimes this is an example of how kids kind of seemingly misapply a what would seem like a rule that they have learned to cases that are in English. There's tons of these cases that are actually exceptions to how you use the rule. So for example, the idea, so when you're learning how to make a verb past tense, you know that you can add ed to it, right? But we know, so, let's see, I'm trying to think of some examples that aren't, I don't know, jumped, okay? And there's tons of examples of that where you add ed to talk about past tense of that verb. So what you find with kids is they seem to over-apply, they seem to over-regularize, that's the other term for this, these sort of rules, so they make adorable little mistakes. So my kids would say things like this, oh, I take the cookie yesterday rather than I took the cookie yesterday. So we're talking about kids that are, maybe, 2, something like that. Or yesterday, rather than saying, we went to the store yesterday, Mommy, they said, I go to the store yesterday, right? You see 2-year-olds doing this, and it's very cute and all that. But what it's long been thought to do is reveal the fact that the kid has learned a rule of how to make a word past tense and is over-applying it because English stinks. And there are a lot of exceptions to this sort of thing. Other languages don't have as many problems as English often. But, we say took instead of taked. We say went rather than goed. And so the kid is over-applying this, this past tense rule, suggesting that they have a rule, that they actually have a rule. But the Connectionist folks do a great job in explaining how this sort of thing can happen, not by the over-application of a rule, but rather the kind of connection strengths that occur up until that part when they're speaking, until 2 years old when they're speaking, that, the activation of making something past tense does often, involve adding an ed to that sort of thing. But it's not an explicit rule. It's just, again, something that emerges out of the interaction of the units based on their activation or inhibition strengths over experience. So all these sorts of, there's great examples they go through one-on-one, like all these things seem like language rules, they seem like perception rules, they seem like action rules, motor control rules, all these sort of things. They can all be handled with these simple, by just understanding how these simple interactions work, which is really nice. And again, the appeal, I think, is parsimony. I do. I think it's nice to be able to think that you can get complexity, even if it seems like rule-like complexity, out of simple interactions of units. Okay. And by the way, if you haven't heard about Hebb's synaptic modification rule, the idea if units are simultaneously excited, you increase the connection strength between them if you're talking about activation. And this has been something that has been talked about for a long time in the nervous system. Hebb was one of the first folks to talk about this sort of thing. You do see connection strengths between neurons change with simultaneous excitation. And so those connection strengths are often increased based on simultaneous excitation. So the connectionist models would say is completely consistent with that sort of idea. This is how learning occurs. It's certainly could be related to neuroplasticity as well. And the connectionist modelers would certainly say, yeah, all that stuff is very consistent with connectionism. In fact, connectionism is based on that plasticity, is based on that flexibility that is changing with experience. So learning is absolutely central to this theory, unlike, we did talk a little bit about learning when we talked about computationalism, but it was kind of a secondary concern in some ways. Okay. A couple of other quick things I wanted to say, and then we'll talk about some other aspects of this. Okay. I think we're okay. I'm actually going to probably end a little early today. That's okay. I want to talk about kind of higher the fact that we've been talking about this at a kind of fundamental level for pattern recognition. I wanted to make sure that it could really be kind of pulled up a little bit and seen as the properties that we're seeing can be also observed, the connectionist folks would say, at a higher order level. And what I mean by that is something they call pattern associators. Where we're talking not about, you know, the units changing their kind of connection strength based on experience, but collections of units and potentially collections of large groups of units can have effects on other groups, large groups of units. And you know, that kind of interaction can also change the relationship and connection strengths between them. That's what they meant by pattern associators here. And this is nice because it allows us, as you'll see, to talk about things like you know, multisensory perception and concept formation and things like that. So the pattern of activity in one set of units can induce a pattern of activity in another set of units. And that induction can change over time. It can, you know, be, you know, more quickly induced, more strongly induced based on, you know, the experience of these patterns of activation. So now we're not just talking about their on or off, as we had kind of talked about them before. We're talking about kind of a pattern across units of on-off states and really gradations, I should say more correctly, gradations that maybe even change a little bit over time, and that activity can induce a certain type of activity in another set of units. So basically what we're doing is we're allowing the principles that we've been understanding for connectionism to exist not at just the unit-to-unit level, but now the kind of collection of units to collection of units level, where we even go one step more abstract and talk about that activity in the collection of units as it maybe unfolds over time a little bit, inducing that same thing at another level. I mean, sorry, at another collection of units. So let's just give an example to make it a little bit more understandable, and that's the idea of the sight of a flower, maybe inducing a memory of the smell. Although I have to say it probably goes better the other way, but it's fine. It's easier to have an image of a visual image of a flower than an olfactory image of a flower, which is why it'd probably be better to do it the other way. But it's the same idea. So I look at a flower and then I remember its smell. I could kind of do that. I think of lilacs now, or jasmine. Okay, so our jasmine bush is flowering, not so much now, but it certainly did a few months ago. And the idea is when I look at that bush, I can imagine its smell. And is that something that can be described or explained even, but with this pattern associated idea? And they say absolutely. You're seeing the flowers, and that's going to involve a large group of units working together. That's probably going to go through a processing over the course of a few microseconds or something like that, and that processing over all the units that occur in the site of a flower then induce activity in what memory system I have that's involved in the smell of the flower, all the units that would be involved in the smell of the flower. Okay. And it's all based on, the simultaneous connection strengths and all that sort of thing. And these kind of pattern associators, which are basically, you really can just think of these as kind of higher order sort of networks, basically, kind of collections of subnetworks and subunits and all that sort of thing. They have the same exact principles as the unit connections that we were talking about before. They can handle, the impoverished input. They can have the features of graceful degradation, that sort of thing. And they are built up from the natural associations as we experience these things of the input. So it's the seeing and the smelling of the flowers again and again that allow these connections to exist across modalities in this case. And again, the idea of these solutions emerging out of the relationship between the units, in this case, the relationship between the groups of units that are going to allow there to be this activation in another sensory modality without any sort of supervisor needed, without kind of one guy making a choice up on top. It's just again, connection strengths changing in this case across big groups of units that can change over time. And they emerge. It's the same idea of an emergent solution, but at a kind of more macroscopic level, a more abstract level, to account for things like multisensory perception and more kind of problem solving they try to apply it to, and other things like that. Okay, it's no different. It's just they want to be able to apply the same principles to higher order sorts of cognitive skills. Okay, what else? Let's talk a little bit about this, and I'm not going to hold you responsible for the details. I don't think I actually have posted the paper. I used to post this paper, but there is a very influential model of speech perception, which of course is my area, called the trace model, which is a very nice fleshed out example of a connectionist system that applies to speech. And you can, we already saw a little bit of this when we were discussing phonemic restoration, where you could, imagine that there are units for features to the degree that, features can help with this, units for phonemes and units for words. They talk about relative activations and all that sort of stuff. Certainly, things like the word level is going to come down and play a role. The features are going to probably not be as, the feature that I would imagine, because of what we've talked about with features not being very straightforward for the sounds of speech, are going to, really have to require a dealing with graceful degradation, right? So I think in this case, graceful degradation can be, what is kind of almost the norm with speech, because the features are going to be so dependent on the context. Now, of course, the context is something that's, going to be, I guess, informed by, the activation that's happening at the word level that's playing a role to also influence what the segment level, the phoneme level is doing. But, here you have an example of based on what you know about speech perception, and it's the co-articulation having such a destructive kind of result on the features. It's got to deal, this type of system is going to have to deal with the degradation that occurs out of from co-articulation all the time. But in theory, it can. And they show some neat examples of that. I don't think I have you read this paper anymore, but I think it's important that you see something other than text being addressed here. And they're able to do some really interesting things. So they actually can do things like they can show how these systems can handle the phenomena of categorical perception and the McGurk effect. And I won't get into the details of that, but these solutions are going to, again, involve just the relationship between simple components, the simple components that represent, if we're talking about auditory categorical perception, it would all be the auditory features, the phonemes, the words. But for the McGurk effect, somehow it's going to have to incorporate visual features as well. And it's going to have to probably involve something like the pattern associators that they believe are required to go across modalities. And I don't remember exactly how that works. But then there'll be, for visual phonemes and possibly visual words too, if it's a McGurk effect that involves words or whatever. And they were able to derive, I don't remember the details, but they were able to derive predictions of the McGurk effect based on one's kind of phonological experience, one's native language, and all that stuff. And they did a very elegant job in doing so. Again, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could explain these things without having to bring in explicit algorithms that the system has to somehow kind of learn. Again, we're trying to go for pruning as much away as possible in an explicit rule set that would be typical of a more computational perspective. Okay. Oh, it also does things for, reaction times for word recognition. Yeah, so priming is we've talked a little bit about priming here. So if we work now at the word level, going up to the semantics and all that stuff, the word meaning level, that, two words, if we present two words that are related to each other in meaning and ask people to say whether the second, or just to say out loud what the second word is. If like you say table and chair and time how long it takes them to say chair out loud, they're just asked to say the second word. Okay, they will say chair faster after it is if it's followed by table than if it's followed by softball or something like that, right? So that we call semantic priming, and clearly that's going to be something that's occurring at the word level of units, where if you heard terms such as spreading activation, that sort of thing, you're really talking about aspects that are easily engendered in connectionist models. Okay, so this is the time course for top-down effect. Don't worry about that sort of stuff. But it's also been applied, just so we know, to speech production, where I guess you would talk about the system starting with something like a meaning, going into a word and going into segments and going into features, if you wanted to talk about that. And the features, of course, being things that would then have a bearing on our articulatory states, the musculature, all that sort of stuff. They've come up with connectionist models for binocular vision and sentence processing and memory. Oh, and here's the idea here, spreading activation. And this is just semantic priming, basically. That's what I just mentioned. We say chair more quickly if it's preceded by table than if it's preceded by softball. And that's because of the meaningful relationship between the words as a function of them maybe, being presented together in a sentence or presented with the same sentence context or something like that. The strength between those words is greater than the strength of the connection between table and chair is greater than the strength of the connection between softball and chair, and that's what accounts for priming. Okay, so yeah, it's the same solution. It's not an issue of any sort of explicit sort of kind of rules that are guiding this. Instead, it's just the changing pattern the changing connections over time and settling on a pattern. Okay, let me not talk about prototypes. That's prototypes. No, I don't. That's another story, actually. All right, so let's skip that. Yeah, let's see here. Yeah. Okay. All right, so let's just do a quick slide on the appeal of connectionism. And I've been talking about this all the way through, that at least in terms of when the theory was first proposed, and I think probably still, these are probably more physiological, sensible ways of thinking about the relationship between units and the flexibility of the units. Remember this idea of pluripotentiality, right? That as far as we understand connections, we really, these aren't really on and off systems as much as gradations of activity, at least in many systems as we understand them today. It's a system that is based on learning, so it easily learns without explicit rules. So that would be another set of kind of appealing aspects of connectionism, I think. And it is consistent with this idea of emergent properties, where we can talk again about our idea, our friend the termite nest and all this other stuff that we talked about, right? I won't go through the story again. I guess I had done these in 2 different lectures originally, but the we're trying to understand if there are solutions to complex problems that don't involve a complex sort of rule system given to an animal. There is no blueprint in the termite's head. The nests come out of an interaction of simple components, which is one of the things that connectionism also has about it. And I won't go through this again. And whether we're talking about bird flocking, fish schooling, animal herding, traffic patterns, that sort of thing, it's, I think, appealing to see this kind of general economy in nature that you don't want, one of the things we discussed in the very beginning of the course was we didn't want to have to add something special for mental representation. Remember, we said that, one of the kind of troubling things about psychology that kind of makes us, which worries us as psychologists, which worries philosophers, which certainly worries other scientists, is trying to figure out ways of solving mental problems that don't involve a new language or some sort of observer that has to be in the system. Wouldn't it be nice if we could find solutions that seem more continuous with the other sciences, where we see this glorious economy of nature, right? Whether it's in flocking patterns and things like that, whether it's in the step cycle, all this sort of stuff. Wouldn't it be great if we could show that cognition and psychology also make use of kind of these natural dynamic systems, so we didn't have to have this burden of the mental, or at least as much of a burden as the mental. It's an appealing aspect, and it's something the connectionist certainly would propose would be one of its appealing characteristics relative to a more kind of strict computational approach. Okay, let's move in now. If there's questions at any point, let me answer them. But if not, we can go ahead and start talking about some of the implications of connectionism. And let me just make sure I can go through this okay. Yeah, I think I can. Okay. So we're going to be reading a set of papers, and I think I'm just going to go through the first one today. Yes. Okay. So I might end up a little early because I want to go back and read the other papers, because you guys seem really, based on some of the questions I got today, you guys seem like you're going to be really interested in the relationship between computationalism and connectionism. So I actually want to go back. I have the slides for it, but I want to go back and read those papers again to make sure I really nail it. And we're going kind of quickly, so that's not really a problem. So let me talk, though, about this set of implications of connectionism. When connectionism first became popular, some of the philosophers jumped on this and really tried to push it. And one of the things they pushed was whether connectionism was just another way of thinking about very simple, stimulus response associationism, right? So PDP, I'm using connectionism and PDP, standing for parallel distributed processing, interchangeably. It will change a little bit later, but I don't care too much about it right now. And so what is connectionism or PDP? I think your paper calls it PDP. That's why I'm going with this. And yeah, it is the notion that representations or ideas do get linked through experience. And based on that, new ideas can emerge, right? And so, whether it's words that emerge as representations or whatever, it does seem to be, and ideas here can be just representations of, say, letters in the feature analysis sort of example that we've been using all day. They do get linked through experience, and experience is going to change those links, as we said. That's an absolutely critical part, and new ideas emerge. And so isn't that what Pavlov was talking about? Isn't that what, Skinner was talking about. And by now, there were, serious criticisms of Skinner as an example when it came to things like language and being able to, what we call generative language syntax, where you can take a finite set of items and convey an infinite number of ideas, and whether true kind of associationist sort of explanations could handle that, and was thought that it failed, that the kind of behaviorism failed when it came to language ultimately. And as Fodor would say, cognition is based on a language of thought, so it really fails, according to Fodor at least, on really capturing cognition. So they would say that, yeah, it's possibly we're just kind of turning back to stimulus response sort of associationism, and it's going to fail again because there's no inherent structure involved here. Okay? But the reply would be that, in fact, connectionism is more than just stimulus response links. It's more than just association. Okay. There are components in connectionist systems that are different than just input and output, okay, that exist. And what they are sometimes called are hidden units, and it's not a great name for them. It just means that there are units between what you would see as input and what you would see as output, say in a simple, maybe reflex or something, a reflexive sort of action or something like that. There is a layer here that actually imparts structure to the process that involves input and output, that exists between the sensory units and the action units. There are other units in here that basically take on something like a cognitive role. Okay, so let's just think of our text recognition example. You present text to the system, it then comes out with what the word is, or what the missing letter or the smudged letter is, or whatever. And you say, okay, is that just based on an association system? And what the connection, sorry, an alarm's going off. What the connectionist system says is that no, there are units in here that actually add to the workings of the system. Just hoping that's not my car. Sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear that. Okay, let me go. Let me take a.
Yeah, maybe you should check.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's stealing it, but I'll be right back. Sorry, everybody.
Impromptu break.
I love whenever professors are like, yeah, I'm going to end early today.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least like 5 minutes or something. Must have been his car.
Could be.
It was not my car.
Oh, but it turned off when you went to look at it, so therefore it must have been yours.
No, it didn't exist. It was a solipsistic car. It didn't exist until I went out, and then it turned off. Anyway, it's great. Okay, so what they're saying is that it's more. Is it microphone okay? Yeah. Okay. It's more than just input and output, that there are actually units in between, and these units can stand for letters, segments, and phonemes and stuff like that, or features, or words that are in fact something separate from the input and output. So it does assume the mind has structure, and that structure actually adds to the process. according to Skinner, there really wasn't much structure to understand. It was a black box, and it really didn't matter what the structure was. It was just fully characterizing the input and the output. So there was no real, cognitive aspect to, what Pavlov was doing or what Skinner was doing. And what the connectionists are saying is, no, this is a cognitive system where the stuff inside that you really, can't readily observe is the stuff that's important. And that's the job of the connectionist modeler, is to establish what those things are in between, what those units are representing, how those units are connected to each other, and then how those units are related to the output and the input. And very often there's going to be multiple layers of hidden units there. So it absolutely imparts structure to the input. And that is the job of the connectionist modeler, is to determine, what is what the nature of those units inside are. And so it makes PDP much more cognitive in that sense. It makes connectionism much more cognitive in that sense. And again, I'm sorry about using PDP here, but that's the way your paper does it. Okay, it's the same thing in this context as connectionism. Okay, but there are clearly differences that are different from classic cognitive approaches or classic computational approaches. I believe they call it cognitive in the paper, but you can think of it as computational approaches. First of all, they want to do away with inference making, right? Remember, this was a real kind of important characteristic of computational models, where you would gather in all the evidence you could, and then add to that the kind of memory we have of how to interpret these various cues, right? And then arrive at a solution that best fit the input and the memory information. And they completely want to do away with that. They want to say that there is no inference making involved here. It is just an interaction of the simple components. And they're going to re-emphasize learning, which is something that at least the kind of more formal models of computation in the 80s and 90s did not do a lot of. Okay, there were certainly computational theories of learning and all that sort of stuff, but they didn't, kind of drive the theory based on learning. And this is absolutely a theory that is driven on understanding learning and experience-dependent change, which is nice because it's something that's now we're very, very interested in all of cognition and in psychology. Also, cognitivism, to some degree, relied on a nativism. And what I mean by that is what I mentioned before, actually, this idea of Jerry Fodor's, that there's a language of thought. And Jerry Fodor has a book called Language of Thought. I believe, if I didn't, I might have posted a paper that's like a summary of that book or something like that. And it's a very simple idea that understanding language kind of provides a window on the mind. And why is that? Well, because all thought, and not, what we're talking about here is, basically any mental process. When he says thought here, he means mental process. That mental process is kind of quasi-linguistic, that, there are, premises, there are, kind of logical ways that you order the representations, and that really can be considered a language. And so the cognitive scientist's job then is to understand how that language is kind of fleshed out. And it should do so. It should be done in a way that's similar to how linguists, parse, how sentences are parsed and that sort of thing. So what's meant here by a language of thought is very clearly, kind of embracing a rule, kind of algorithmic way of thinking of mental process. So rules and representations are absolutely, kind of core principles in a computational approach. That's Fodor's very, very explicit about that. And clearly, as we've been discussing, connectionism isn't going to embrace that idea. It's not going to buy into that idea. Yes, you can see behaviors that seem like they are rule-based, like the over-application of the past tense rule, like the interpretation of nonsense words apparently following the rules of spelling, that sort of thing. But they are not rules that are kind of explicit in the system. They're not part of the programming. They emerge naturally. The behaviors emerge naturally to seem like they're based on a rule, but they are not based on a rule. They're just based on these, interactions of units and collections of units and how those change over experience. It allows it to seem like it's based on rules and representations. It allows mental process to look like it might be like a language, but it's not. It's just simple little interactions between these units, right? Yeah, okay, that's good. Let's leave that there, actually. And I think, yeah, so we'll end a few minutes early today. Unless there's questions, we'll take up some more of this discussion and compare connectionist and computational approaches more next week. But are there questions at this point?
So the connected structure is still formal, right?
Say that again. The what structure is still formal?
Like the connected, the structure that the connected connectionism it's assuming. It's like it's still a formal system, right?
Formal in that they are representations, yes, without inherent meaning, that sort of thing. Is that what you're saying? Is that what you mean by formal?
Yeah, so it still cannot get access to this, like the
meaning.
Semantic properties.
Yeah. I think right now we can say that. Yeah, we'll see if we can maintain that. But yes, we'll talk about how that's dealt with. Absolutely, good point. Other questions or comments at this point? Okay, great. We'll see you next Tuesday, and hopefully by Friday I'll be able to send you each back your exams graded. Okay, bye everybody.